just a quick rerun, really, I suppose, of a keynote that I did recently for a small conference entitled "I Wouldn't Start From Here: Education, Learning and the Rise of Generative AI." So, where this interest has come from is a report that I saw first on LinkedIn 2 or 3 weeks ago about a UCLA student who was happy to show his use of AI as a way of completing some of his assignments for his degree. And I thought this was really quite an interesting story. And I think that one of the things I found particularly interesting was the comments section below the story, which had the usual complete spectrum of different viewpoints, really, about what this said concerning the state of education and the use of AI within education. And a lot of the views ranged from some people saying that this demonstrated that there's a need to fundamentally alter education to incorporate and accept generative AI. Some people sort of talking artificial intelligence up as being this sort of powerful, almost omnipotent new process that can achieve absolutely anything that we would hope it would do, and that it either already does or will outdo humans in every possible way in the near future. Some people sort of basically saying, the fact that somebody's done this demonstrates that education as we know it is dead, the universities are busted flush and we don't need them anymore, etc., etc. And even some people sort of going back to that sort of age-old idea that sort of first came around when things like Google and Wikipedia first arrived, that, well, do we actually need formal education at all? We are now in a position where AI can give us everything we need straight away, etc., etc. So this really got me thinking about thinking through about some of the characteristics of AI, but also what this makes us do in reflecting on what we actually think education is about, and whether or not we are in a position where we just have to accept that AI is here and effectively just accommodate it in every way possible, or whether there's a different way of thinking through the problem. And even though sort of there are some real cheerleaders for AI, there are issues with it. So issues, for example, with hallucination. The idea that inaccuracies or untruths in training materials can actually then incorporate themselves into the kind of responses that AI gives. And a typical example of that within academia is the problem with ghost references, where you'll get a list of references in what somebody has written, but actually when you go and try and find those references, they don't exist, because all the large language model that is doing is literally putting together what it thinks is the next best word in a chain. There isn't, strictly speaking, in that sense, much intelligence about it. We know that there are problems with biases, again, in terms of what has been learned, but as became apparent from Elon Musk's Grok chatbot, this kind of thing can spiral out of control, and Grok appeared at one point to have a serious problem with learned extremism, at one point even calling itself Mecha Hitler. One of the other things that we're beginning to perhaps find just limited evidence for, I don't think it's something that necessarily suggests that AI should be banned from education, but it gives us food for thought, is research from MIT that seem to suggest that people using generative AI can lead to them losing thinking skills, becoming less able, in essence, to study. And I think in much of this, a lot of the kind of discussions that we have, there's actually very little consideration of the wider social, cultural, and philosophical issues. So, whilst on the one side you've got people, some people who are saying, education as we know it is dead, generative AI is going to utterly change the way that everything happens, particularly in education, while you have some people at the other end sort of bemoaning anything to do with AI, we have to actually try to keep a degree of balance and accept that there are restrictions, there are problems with AI that need further consideration. And in general, one of the things that you begin to see, I think, particularly in higher education, in universities, some of the sort of narratives that I've seen is this sort of emerging narrative where really it's mostly about how we accommodate generative AI and reshape education to accept it, rather than thinking perhaps a little bit more deeply about the issues involved. And I think we need to really give some thought as to why generative AI is seen as being so powerful, given some of these obvious limitations, given the fact that some people um, within the sector itself appear to already be saying that the hallucination issue is so deeply embedded that regardless of what anybody tries to do now within the next decade, AI will almost be useless because the problem with hallucination will amplify. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But it's this idea that the main narrative quite often is that this thing is just really powerful. Um, but why is it that there's been such a positive reaction to it and only very mooted critique of it to a degree? Well, I think this is multifaceted. I think perhaps there are elements in here that, the marketing budget of large tech is very large. So it's very easy for very rich, very large companies to, in some way, skew the kind of narrative that we gain and to really emphasize the positives about AI. I think there's also an issue that there tends to be a preference for novelty by human beings. We like shiny new things. We like to play around with things, and obviously, artificial intelligence is giving us a really big space in which we can go and play and try things out, and it appears to be giving us a lot of really cool stuff very, very rapidly. But also, we've already had the Trojan horse of social media. So over the last 20 years, we as a species have got more and more used to the idea of communicating at pace, in terms of being able to interact in ways other than through face-to-face or written formats or what have you. And therefore, social media and people's fascination with, and in many cases, sort of almost um, their need to use social media has acted as a way of softening us up in terms of AI. But I would also argue, if you haven't read this book by Harmut Rosa, I would very much recommend it. Sort of Social Acceleration: A New Theory of Modernity. What Harmut Rosa essentially argues is that as a society, we have gone through a process of living generally in a faster and faster and faster way. And I get the impression, particularly in academia, particularly in schools, AI is seen as a way of saving us time. You can do administration through AI, or you can get AI to plan lessons for you so you don't have to do it. And yet there seems to be very, very little thought about, well, actually, why are we needing this to happen? And is that because actually the level of work intensification, the amount of work that we are expected to do has become so unsustainable due to the acceleration and the ever greater amount of work that we're expected to do, that actually AI begins to be seen as just being a way of making things sustainable. And that is an understandable reaction, but actually what that then means is that we're becoming more and more users of AI, not necessarily because we think it does a better job, but because it allows us to get through the volume of work that we're expected to get through. But I would also argue that there's one other aspect here that's important. That's our development of a neoliberal education system, and the development of that, particularly through new public managerialism from particularly the early 90s onwards, has led to an education system that is predominantly focused on notions of efficiency. Are we doing everything efficiently? And also issues of accountability. So I think our relationship that is fast emerging with AI is actually really complex. It's multidimensional. There are clearly positive opportunities involved, but there are also really serious potential pitfalls. And here, what I want to do is just think a little bit more about what I see as being some of the main issues within the sort of the educational dimension of the rise of generative AI. I think neoliberal education has been, talked about ad infinitum within academia, and we know that sort of some of the main traits of neoliberal education are things like the marketization of education, the rise of competition, particularly within HE settings, within university settings, students as consumers. But then also there are aspects around ever greater regulation and accountability, and also standardization of work. And I would argue that these are some of the main characteristics of a neoliberal education system. But I also want to just pick up on something that is generally not well considered. It's a piece of work that very few people even know exists, and that is the idea of dividuation as explained by Gilles Deleuze in a paper that he published originally in 1990 in French and then in 1992 in English. This paper was called The Postscript to the Societies of Control, and in it, one of the things that Deleuze does, it's only very short, it's only about 4 or 5 pages long, it's really quite a brief read. But one of the things he argues is that if we go back to the 1950s and 1960s and the work of Michel Foucault, that work is really treating people, individuals, as part of groups. It's about group identity, group dynamics and processes, looking at things like clinics and prisons. His own work with Félix Guattari by the 1970s and 1980s is then moving on from that, is then looking at the reactions of individuals to neoliberalism and globalization, mainly through almost a sort of a psychoanalytical lens. But he argues by the early 90s that he believes we've moved on again. And I think this is an amazing piece of insight, really, by Gilles Deleuze, because this is before computers really have taken off in anything like a meaningful way. But what he argues is that by the 1990s, we've got to a stage of what he calls dividuation. What he means by this is that by this point in time, you have human beings, and flowing by the side of them is data about them. And that therefore these two things are actually flowing through time in a parallel fashion. And that dividuation in many ways is actually about the focus on the data rather than the person. And an ideal example of this might be supermarket chains, where they'll give you a loyalty card, and every time you pay for your groceries, you get some points on this card for being a customer. They're not interested in you as an individual, as a human. They're interested in your data and collecting more of your data to aggregate with everybody else to help them be more effective and efficient in the way that they are buying groceries and so on for themselves to try and maximize profit. Now, I would argue that really one of the most insidious aspects of neoliberal education is that more and more and more we've seen dividuation within the education system, where actually it's people's data that have become more important than the individuals, both in terms of children and particularly teachers. And I would argue that any system where the data is more important than the human is by definition an inhumane system. Now, what that means is that we've got a system that is really all about efficiency, and it's about getting the right data. It's that individual process. And I would argue that this has led us in the direction of what I would call sort of naive cognitivism as a model of learning, that actually what you end up with is quite simplistic models of learning that are wholly cognitive in form, that essentially it's only cognitive processes that matter, and actually models that increasingly just focus on the efficient processing of information, where teaching and learning really just becomes a very narrow monoculture, which says there's this information here. We have to get that information into your head as efficiently as we possibly can. So these are the narrow set of techniques that allow us to do that. And then we will test you to make sure that we understand just how much you've remembered. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this rise, and it's been particularly strong in England, I would argue, is that there's very little philosophical basis for this as an educational model, in as much as it's almost just accepted that this is how learning is, and it is a transfer of information that makes up learning and education. That education isn't, that there's very little discussion that education might be something far wider. But what's really interesting is as soon as you sort of adopt this kind of naive cognitivism, in many ways you're adopting a theory of learning which is very close to generative AI. And therefore, in many ways, this perhaps is why generative AI for some people has been seen as being such a huge boost in education, because in essence the way that an AI works and the kind of things that an AI can do very much synchronize with that sort of naive cognitivist way of thinking about learning, where education is really just a process of memorization and regurgitation, and therefore AI fits very closely to that model, and therefore can be seen as being, an absolutely essential move forward in education. However, there are other ways of thinking about learning to begin with. So one is to see learning as being multidimensional. This is a model that I've used for a long time now from the work of somebody called Knud Elleris, who is a Danish psychologist. And what he argues is that there's actually three dimensions to learning. There is obviously the cognitive. Again, as I'm not saying we should never use AI, I'm not saying that learning isn't, to some degree, perhaps to a large degree, cognitive, but it's also emotional. It's also an emotive process around things like motivation, for example, or your emotional state, which can affect how you learn. And the cognitive and the emotional together is, if you like, the acquisitional element together of learning. But then there's also the interactional, there's a social aspect to learning as well. And that learning, according to Elleris, learning is a fundamentally social process as well as emotional and cognitive. So what this begins to do is to challenge the idea that human learning is a sort of purely naive cognitivist process, which very much aligns with AI. Actually, it has other dimensions to it as well. And then learning can be begun to be seen as part of a complex orientated set of processes. It's an emergent process, and therefore as well as it being within the individual, it's also social and cultural. So it's a much more complexity driven way of beginning to understand learning. And therefore, what I would argue is that actually, if we put AI to one side for a moment, we need to begin to reevaluate what we want education to be and what it's about. And I would argue this is particularly pressing given that we are living in the midst of a polycrisis globally, climate change, biodiversity loss, massive issues with international migration and economic inequality, etc., etc., etc. And I would argue to begin to capture that more complexity orientated way of thinking about learning, it will be better for us to begin to focus on human development. The human development's more holistic view of what it is education is trying to achieve. It isn't just about the efficient moving of information from one place to another. It's about the much wider development of children that then makes it multidimensional and complex. And there are a few ways in which we can begin to think about this. There's a wonderful piece of work, particularly by Anderson in 2020 on Bildung, which is a predominantly Danish way of thinking about a more holistic way of helping individuals develop through education, particularly around things like ego development. There's the inner development goals, and I'll show an example of what I mean by those in a second. But what this begins to do is open up education as being creative, dialogic, collaborative, all of which then begins to move into areas as an education that can't be easily or even at all mimicked by generative AI, particularly around collaboration and dialogue. Yes, you can talk to a generative AI, but it's not going to offer the same kind of connection and depth and creativity as if you're doing it with other human beings. And within all of this, we should still think about how we're going to use AI, but think carefully. And part of that has to be about digital literacy and criticality around digital media. And there's a quote here from the Director General of the Finnish National Agency for Education, where they're talking about what their digital literacy program is trying to achieve. And I think this is a really useful model, because whereas in England, it's a case of we have problems with mobile phones, and I'm accepting that there are problems with mobile phones. The English reaction to that is, well, we'll just ban it. We'll ban everything, ban it all, stop kids using it, and then they can start using it at 16, as if delaying it will actually somehow then make them judicious users of it when they hit 16. Whereas perhaps what we should be doing is still allowing for engagement with digital media, but doing it in a way that is teaching criticality and literacy, so that as children get older, they begin to enfold the use of digital media into what they do in positive, proactive ways, rather than waiting until they're 16 and possibly just mucking it up then. And what this then means is that education is no longer this sort of very monocultural transferal of information model. It becomes a much more communal and social model. And I think we could learn a great deal from early childhood and early years practice in this regard, where a lot of the kind of issues that I'm talking about here around human development and collaboration and creativity and so on is already done to a huge degree and already done very successfully. And these then help us begin to create models which AI can't mimic. And to give an idea of the kind of things that I'm arguing they can't mimic, this is the inner development goals framework. These are a whole series of competencies that it's argued we need to be able to meet the challenges of the sustainable development goals at an individual level. Things like integrity and authenticity, self-awareness, presence, complexity awareness, sense making, humility, empathy and compassion, co-creation skills, trust. optimism, courage, perseverance. These are a whole series of things that we can begin to get exposure to, begin to understand and learn and develop as human beings, that actually AI either won't be able to or will not be particularly good at. So it's not sort of saying do this and forget AI, but it then allows us to move into an educational system that in many ways is complementary to elements of AI, and where we can begin to be more confident and secure in our understanding of the things that we do incredibly well as a species, and don't lose sight of that to some kind of sort of very simplistic view that somehow AI will be able to do everything for us. And obviously this then impacts on a whole series of things. It impacts on our notions of the curriculum. Curriculum obviously needs knowledge. It needs a knowledge base within it, but what kind of knowledge base should we have? And where's the understanding aspect of that? How does understanding come in alongside knowledge and help knit knowledge together? Perhaps it then means that we need much wider notions of assessment, and not just sort of say, well, because AI can do some decent writing, all we should have now are pen and paper tests because it's the only thing we can trust. Perhaps actually if we include within some of our assessments some of these sort of softer skills or competencies, etc., actually we can have a much broader view of what assessment is, that allows us to assess things that we're really good at that AI can't mimic. And as I've just sort of said, we need to then think about the role of knowledge and understanding. And I don't mean this in terms of we don't need this anymore because AI can do it. We need to start thinking about what areas of knowledge are really important and which areas of knowledge we need to really develop. And that includes this idea of digital literacy. So what I think the place I get to with this argument, I suppose, is the idea that there is and will always be a role for technology in education, but we need to see it as an important tool that can facilitate things and make various aspects of what we do easy, but that we also accept that it can't replace a lot of what it means to be human and what we do really well as humans in terms of our adaptability, our soft skills, etc. And therefore it needs to be an important tool, but not a controlling element. We can't let it dictate to us exactly what education is going to look like. The only way that it is going to do that if we carry on with this very narrow view of what learning and education should be. And it should get us to reflect and think about and question how we see ourselves in an era of existential threat and polycrisis, and therefore how we can create an education that makes the best use of some of these tools while ensuring that we don't lose so much of what is going to be essential for us to meet the crises that we are part of with a degree of confidence and hopefully overcome them as time goes by. And therefore, I would argue personally that what we need is an education focused on human development for both students and teachers, which is communal and collaborative rather than competitive, and which identifies and accentuates and develops core aspects of human development, what it means to be human, including knowledge, including understanding, and including aspects of artificial intelligence, but done in such a way that enhances our quality of development rather than us becoming slaves to it. And just to finish off with, these are the references from some of the things that I've mentioned during the presentation. Thank you.